Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to give it just a couple minutes to get started, not too long, because we have a lot to talk about. While we're waiting, it would be great to know where people are coming from. We saw a lot of people from all over in our registration. Would love to know who's here and where you're coming from. I guess I can tell you, I'm Carrie Miller from Cleveland, from HFLA Northeast Ohio.
Did you want us to just say it out loud or just type it?
Just put it in the chat. Thanks, Laura. Also, as you were seeing, we are set up as a traditional Zoom meeting. So if you want fewer people, fewer boxes on your screen, you can hit the speaker view, and that'll help minimize the number of boxes. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to talk about today, and I want to make sure we have time to get as much information shared as possible. So good morning. It is still morning here in Cleveland. So good morning and or afternoon, and welcome to Is a Job Enough? Examining the financial positions of working Americans. My name is Carrie Miller. I'm the Assistant Director for HFLA of Northeast Ohio. For those of you who are not familiar with HFLA, the topic of financial security is particularly relevant to us. Our mission is to provide interest-free loans to promote the economic self-sufficiency and growth of Northeast Ohioans who are unable to access safe and fair lending resources. And we've been doing this for 118 years. We are one of many free loan associations, societies across the country, but we are not all part of the same. So if you have one in your neighborhood, please say hi for us. But so our program today is informing a broader conversation HFLA is going to be hosting in the fall with Jonathan Mordock, Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the Wagner Graduate School at New York University and co-author of Financial Diaries, How American Families Cope in a World of Uncertainty. So please stay tuned for more information about that event coming in October. The first thing we would like to do is thank our sponsors who are making this and all of our events this year possible. So the Good Community Foundation, the Charles M. and Helen M. Brown Memorial Foundation in memory of Judge Raymond Pianka, PNC Bank, and Growth Ops. Thank you so much for your support and helping us to bring these issues to light and to elevate the stories of our borrowers. Our borrowers often have to work 2 or more jobs, rely on 1 or more forms of public support, or earn just enough that they don't qualify. Even though they may work multiple jobs or work far more than the traditional 40-hour work week, they're still not able to make enough to cover the cost of an emergency when it arises, a medical bill, a home or car repair, or one of the many other situations that we all know arise on a daily basis. In order to meet basic needs, we see borrowers often have to shuffle resources by covering bills with credit cards, or after getting behind in everything, having to cover costs with payday or other predatory loans. We hope the conversation today begins to uncover why our borrowers, along with millions of other Americans, are doing all the right things, but are still struggling to get by. Before I introduce our speakers, I do want to do a little framing for today's conversation. I'm going to go ahead and assume that everybody on this call is pretty much aware that we're coming out of a global pandemic that highlighted many of the intricacies of the challenges our communities are facing. Although the pandemic highlighted and in many cases exacerbated these issues, the challenges faced by the working poor have been around for a long time. And what we're talking about today transcends the effects of the pandemic. So although it will come up, we're not talking about what the pandemic did and how it affected these issues. Another piece of framing, we are all clear that there is a demographic disparity within the affected population. The Black and Brown communities are disproportionately affected by these economics. Women are disproportionately affected by these issues. While we may not dive into the specifics of these disparities, this conversation is held through that lens. The last piece I do want to acknowledge is that the participants on this panel are not currently reflective of the population we're discussing in terms of facing these issues on a daily basis. That is not to say that none of us have never had these experiences, but we are not currently facing these challenges. Today, we want to focus on root causes. And as we begin to dive deeper into this conversation, we will make a point to include the voices of the lived experience as we go. With that, don't want to talk for too long. With that, we're going to get down to it. I'm going to do very brief introductions of our panelists and then give our speakers an opportunity to do further introductions of themselves and give some introductory remarks. We want to hear from you though. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we're going to work to get those questions into the conversation. We did receive a few in advance of this, so we will work very hard to get those involved. But with that, I'm going to introduce Sheida Elmi, who is the Senior Research Manager at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program, and Hannah Halbert, who is the Executive Director of Policy Matters Ohio. And they're just going to give some introductory remarks. So I'm just going to go alphabetical order by last name. And Sheida, if you wouldn't mind getting us started.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm joining from Denver, so it is extra morning time for me. Thanks, Carrie, so much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here to discuss how workers in the U.S. are faring and the ways that we can be moving ourselves towards a more inclusive economy that works for everyone. So good morning. My name is Sheida Elmi. I am with the Financial Security Program. So our mission is really to illuminate and solve the most critical financial challenges facing people in the U.S. today. And our aim is an inclusive economy with reduced wealth inequality and shared prosperity. The foundation of financial security really is routinely positive cash flow, where income typically exceeds expenses. This is something that supports families' ability to build a financial cushion, absorb shocks, big and small, maintain stability in consumption, pay down debt, and build longer-term savings. So that said, routinely positive cash flow is out of reach for nearly half of all households in the U.S. Carrie kind of spoke to some of these things, but I'll just kind of dive in a little bit here to set the stage. In the United States, work and the opportunity to earn income from work has long been understood as a route to security and to success, an antidote to poverty. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that this really isn't the reality for many workers in the U.S. today. Instead, the majority of workers in America have jobs that don't allow them to achieve financial stability, let alone financial security. And even before the pandemic, 53 million workers, just under half, were earning low wages, less than $18,000 annually. And that's looking at workers between the ages of 18 and 64. In fact, what we end up seeing in the US is a two-tiered system of employment, with higher paying jobs being more likely to also provide workers with robust workplace benefits such as healthcare, retirement, and paid leave. And the discretionary nature of workplace benefits means that millions of workers are also facing challenges accessing those critical workplace benefits and supports. So for instance, when we look at employer-provided health insurance and retirement plans, we see significant gaps in access between the lowest and the highest paid workers, between part-time and full-time workers, workers in non-standard work arrangements, things like temporary or on-call workers, and workers in more traditional situations. Making matters worse, even when workers have access to workplace benefits, lower levels of take-up often result in lower levels of participation. So individuals may choose not to participate for a variety of reasons. We'll probably get into that later. But that can be that the available benefits are just not high quality or maybe unaffordable to them. And even when employers are offering benefits, many have shifted the cost and the liability of those benefits to their employees, such as through the adoption of things like a high deductible health plan. Together, this highlights the struggle that workers face to utilize benefits when they need their full paycheck to make ends meet, the importance of removing barriers to access, improving design and delivery, and ensuring affordability so that the burden of cost does not fall on the workers alone. As I've kind of covered, not only are higher paid workers making more money, they're also more likely to be able to participate and contribute more to the benefits that they are offered through their workplace, which compounds the differences that we see in the financial outcomes between workers. So a large portion of workers are having to supplement their pay with public benefits, as Carrie just mentioned. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that nearly half of all working recipients of public benefits work full-time hours. So full-time work is not enough. And while public benefits are really critical for millions of families and workers, they're often not enough. Public benefits reduce levels of poverty in the US by nearly half. But even when access, again, the households are often struggling to make ends meet because these programs are not necessarily built to be fully sufficient and to fully cover needs in addition to the work that they're doing. So taken together, this is why we found in our research that the current system of work and benefit arrangements really are only working for one type of worker, where higher income full-time workers that are also receiving workplace benefits are those that also stand a really good shot at financial security. This doesn't have to be the case going forward. We could be creating systems where more opportunities exist for workers beyond those arrangements, but it does underscore that public benefits, and especially the programs that we consider the social safety net, are a critical complement to pay as well as the workplace benefits that are provided. But the three together must be considered jointly as we look to the full package of what workers need today. I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Sheida. Hannah?
All right. Thank you, Sheida. Thank you, everyone out there for joining us this morning. We're still counting it for a few more minutes here. And certainly thank you for Carrie and all those who have worked to host this today. It's not too often that we get time in our lives and in our work to take a step back and think about the big picture, like how we got here. Is this working? What do we mean whenever we use these words like poor, working poor? And so this is I just appreciate the space and the time that folks are taking to make that effort. So welcome and thank you. I'm Hannah Halbert. I am the Executive Director of Policy Matters Ohio, and I saw a lot of familiar names showing up on this list. So many of you may already know about our organization, but if you're unfamiliar, we are a research institution, a think tank, and our home base is in Cleveland, Ohio, but we have offices also in Columbus. And what we are focused on is looking at state policy. Sometimes that means federal policy, sometimes that means local policy, but looking at how the state policy landscape is making Ohio a more vibrant, sustainable, equitable, and inclusive place for all of us, no exceptions. And a lot of the time that turns into us looking at the economy and really trying to understand, is this economy working for all? And if not, why not? And what can be done so that we can all share in the prosperity that we are all helping to create in the state? So I welcome you to, learn more about Policy Matters. Our website's easy, policymattersohio.org. If you're interested in these kinds of topics, we would be happy to share with all of you. And it's difficult to follow the outline that Sheida brought. I mean, it is, it's hard, it's both complicated and simple. Working people in Ohio, even if they are many people, even if you're doing all the things, playing by all the rules, doing your 40 hours, trying to get ahead, are still struggling with the basics. We've released a major report recently that looked at the 10 most common job occupations in the state and found that many of them were barely keeping a family of 3 above poverty, and certainly many of them were not removing the need for food assistance for those families. Very few in the state were paying enough so that the typical worker in those occupations would be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So, work, there's work, there's data, and it's complicated. And I think that one of the extra layers in this discussion that's not maybe always brought out is that we have data, but we also have this mythology that surrounds these questions about deservedness, the causes of poverty, and oftentimes that becomes racialized in our discussions and in our policies. And so while we can talk about, and we will talk about a lot of data in this discussion, I don't think we can parse out or separate the data from this mythology of the deserved poor and the deserved who gets benefits. So it's a complicated conversation we're going to try to get into a little bit today. If I could offer 2 takeaways from this, from what I hope to convey in our discussion, is one is that we do need to start looking into and questioning this idea of deservedness. Like Sheida said, there's only one worker, a very thin, specific demographic that this system is currently working for, and we should interrogate why that is, and does that have to be? And then the other thing is that none of this is the weather. None of this has to happen. In our own history in Ohio, we have evidence of when we did a better job at helping each other, at taking care of one another, at making sure that families had access to programs that were bringing stability and security to their lives. So much of what we're going to talk about is a result of policy choices, and we can always make better choices if we have the will to do so. So those are 2 things that sort of shaped my thinking going into this conversation, and I really do look forward to hearing everyone's questions and thoughts and learning from you all as you learn from us.
Thank you both. That was a great setup. And again, as we are going through this, as questions arise for anybody, please just feel free to put them in the chat and we'll work to get them included. Before we get started, I have been around long enough to know that the words that we use don't always mean what we're saying. And so I do want to get a sense of a shared language here before we really start to dive in and really get an understanding of who we're talking about, and maybe more importantly, who we're not talking about. And Hannah, you just mentioned it, that this is the distinction between those living in extreme poverty and those that we consider the working poor. And that's something that HFLA is trying to parse out, and would love to get some context from both of you as to what that means in your work. Whomever can, Hannah, why don't you get us started?
So, I think in our work, there's lots of different definitions. I think that's part of the struggles. And I think it's good that we're struggling with that, because I'm not sure we should have a standard definition for that. And I think that we should work hard to, like, if we're all picturing a poor person in our mind, like work hard to unpack a lot of those stereotypical, possibly racialized conceptions, because a lot of times those can lead us into really bad policy choices and not actually be based on reality. You know, something that we look at at Policy Matters whenever we're thinking about working people who are struggling is that we look to a very basic threshold. Are you earning enough? So you're earning a paycheck or you have earned income. And does that income get you over 130% of poverty? So that kind of moves you beyond the need for some of the most inclusive public benefit programs of like food assistance, right? And you know, that's really not that much. And in Ohio, there's about, of the top 10 occupations, so this isn't everyone, but the top 10 occupations, 4 of those don't do enough to reach that basic threshold. And that just 4 cover 452,000 Ohioans. So that is a significant number of people who, even if working full-time year-round in these occupations, are still going to be earning less than 130% of poverty. So I think that that's sort of our internal take on it. And we should all, and you know, certainly we know that 130% of poverty, these metrics don't truly keep up with what all it takes to bring stability to a family. We're talking about very basics. So that's, I'll stop with that, but that's sort of our internal thresholds that we're looking at.
That's great, Hannah, because
security in a second. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear, because I think, you know, at the financial security program, we don't really parse between them. I'm really glad that you brought up the piece around deservedness and would love to dig into that a little bit more later. But we don't really parse between it because we have seen time and time again how many people are struggling with their finances despite working. So we often talk about what is it that low and moderate income families are experiencing? What is it that others are experiencing? Because the reality is that really far up the income ladder, people are struggling. And though they might have had a little bit more of a buffer, they might have some savings, they might be able to kind of withstand a little bit longer of if they lose a job, or if their pay gets changed or cut for some time, or if they experience an injury, they might have benefits and other things that are able to buffer them for longer than those that are lower income that don't have those types of benefits. And so despite us not doing that, I think that we have seen over and over recently with the pandemic, of course, but also even when the government shut down before that, we saw how quickly it was that federal workers were applying for public benefits for the first time. And I think that was very eye-opening for folks, because if you're not staring at these numbers day in and day out, you think it's a federal job, you have great benefits, you're probably getting paid well, but it didn't take long before people had to dive into these programs that are there exactly for that purpose. But whether or not they could actually access them, whether or not the applications made sense, whether the recertifications worked, whether they had the documentation to be able to go through the system or even understand the way to go through it. I think that navigation piece is so critical. And I think, the pandemic also did the same thing. People had to try to apply for unemployment insurance for the first time, or with the expansion, new people were then eligible. So, I'm kind of punting here, but we don't have that distinction because it feels like for so many households, they are working, living paycheck to paycheck, and really living in that like very precarious, maybe we have a little bit of a buffer, but still we could be doing better. We can be doing more.
And just to underscore that, when we look into use of public benefits, and whenever we think about this big myth about dependency, so much of the policy and debate happening around these systems right now is about dependency. My goodness, We don't really see that. Most people are dropping on and off. They're moving in and out, over and across these thresholds in times of crisis, in times whenever there's been an upheaval, when they need that extra support, and then reaching some moments or periods of stability. And so a lot of our, particularly in Ohio, I think a lot of our policy debate is being driven by these really false concepts of what it's like to be working or not working in the state of Ohio and in America. So I think that's an excellent point, Sheida. Thank you for bringing that out.
Two things. One, Hannah, thank you for sharing. 130% of poverty for a family of three is just $28,548. So that is a pretty low threshold. And I think to sort of, again, underscore what you just said, one of the things that has been the most eye-opening to me as I have really started to dig into this is that we look at people in annual terms. So we look at their annual income without really taking into account the fact that it's inconsistent throughout the year, that somebody can be in poverty for 3 months out of the year, maybe not 3 sequential months, but they dip up and down, that income dips up and down, the cash flow dips up and down, and those benefits can serve to get people through that. So as we are defining things and having this conversation, I also too want to really set the stage for what we're talking about when we're talking about financial security. What does that mean and who really is achieving it? And Sheida, you've talked about some of this already. If you could give a little bit more into that.
Sure. At the Financial Security Program, we do have a definition. So we've adopted as our definition of financial security the description of financial well-being that was established by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a state of being wherein a person can fully meet current and ongoing financial obligations, can feel secure in their financial future, and that they are able to make choices that allow them to enjoy life. So in other words, financial security allows people to meet their ongoing needs, have dignity and choice in their current situations, while also making progress towards their short, long, and future goals. So I think I can keep it very simple and just say, those are all the things that we're aiming for. And whether or not people are actually there is probably, half of the conversation today.
Hannah, do you have a sense of that in Ohio? What does financial security look like in Ohio? Are people achieving it?
Well, it depends on where you sit. And I think that there's one of the things I want to draw out about financial security is the word security. And so whenever we look at the labor market in Ohio, job security, the benefits that attach with employment have been eroded. And so even if you are making you've hit that, the housing wage in Ohio, which would be a little bit over $16 an hour, say you've hit that mark, scheduling, because scheduling is really wild right now. I mean, we heard about clopenings where you're closing and opening. You may be on schedule or off schedule, depending on the needs of the employer at that time and demand. It is so unpredictable. It's hard to make a plan. It's hard to plan what your wages are going to be. And so security, I think, goes beyond this question of wages. And in Ohio, just for context, we're a big state. We're a very diverse state. And we have such vast inequality. And so we have counties or cities in Ohio where more than 50% of the kids in that county or in that city are in poverty. We have cities in Ohio where 0% of the kids are in poverty. And so, what once was sort of like this promise that if you worked hard, played by the rules, you got this job, you could rely on your 40 hours, isn't necessarily the case. And then we're learning that place and race has a huge factor into whether you are even going to be in a situation where financial security becomes a possibility for you. And so there's certain things that I think, even if we were to say, okay, if you hit $15 an hour, $16 an hour, you should be secure. And because of this broader erosion of benefits of our employment and labor floor, that's not necessarily the case anymore. And this doesn't even get into the concept of families being able to really plan and invest for their future. We've talked to a lot of folks in the last year in some of our work, trying to understand things like the child tax credit impact, the changes to the unemployment compensation system. And that was something that we kept hearing from people, is that, whenever they were receiving more stable cash benefits from like the economic impact payments that came out through the pandemic, or the CTC payments that came through, we heard families starting to make plans. And that little bit of security, knowing that income is coming and steady, knowing what the floor is, allows people to do that. And that's a big missing piece in sort of what it means to be poor or working poor, or trying to make it in Ohio. There's some great questions coming up in the chat.
Yes. I'm going to bring one in right now. We often frame these conversations in the context of the people who are affected without really diving into the employer side of the conversation. So it would be great to hear from both of you a sense of what wages have looked like over time. We are sort of in unprecedented wage stagnation here, what that has looked like over time and how that has affected where we are.
Sure, I can jump in and turn it over to Hannah. For 40 years, looking up to 2019, so just prior to the pandemic, wages stagnated for low and middle income earners. And it was even slower for some of the demographic groups that we've been discussing, Black and Latinx workers, those living in marginalized communities. The pandemic did change the dynamic for some folks that were able to keep their jobs. A new report by the Economic Policy Institute found that in the last year, wage growth for those workers has grown the fastest of all workers, but given where they started, still not enough. And worse, the data from the BLS is saying that low wage workers, or low wage jobs specifically, are projected to be the ones to grow really exponentially. So again, work alone in those jobs is unlikely to meet the needs of those that are in those positions. So more companies are also turning to part-time workers, contracting out more, and relying more heavily on non-standard workers, non-traditional workers, who often don't have the same legal rights and protections, nor access to the same level of workplace benefits, because oftentimes those are also state or federally mandated, depending on the classification of the worker. So again, those that are overrepresented there are folks that are people of color, women, immigrants, people living with disabilities, and then workers that face employment barriers, like those without documentation or returning citizens, the formerly incarcerated, are also more likely to hold those positions. And when we then look at public benefit offerings, there may also be like a lot of overlap between who is and is not eligible for those things. So, I think we'll be talking about solutions later, but just recognizing that not everybody has the same access to the types of safety nets and programs, and that the projections right now are not looking great in terms of work being the thing that is solely going to be enough to cover.
Yeah, I'm going to interject really quickly there and ask, and I don't know if this sort of falls under either of your research at this time, but there are fears of wages not meeting the price of increased costs. Those are fans of the West Wing. I'm trying not to say the R word, the bagel here, but so where does that fall into this? Is that part of this? Where do wages go as prices may or may not continue to increase?
So with the sort of where were wages up to the pandemic? So we look in most common, again, in Ohio. So where a bunch of us were working, a bunch of Ohioans were working from 2000 to 2019, we saw wages really being pushed down in some unexpected places. So over that time, home health aides lost about $1.30, customer service reps $1.16, stock order fillers lost about a quarter, retail sales lost out, laborers and freight handlers lost out. Whenever we extend the timeline to include our post-pandemic wage surge, we're just, it kind of looks like some of us got back to 2000, right? So that's not really getting ahead. And so the range of change, registered nurses who are kind of at the top end of that range are getting paid 18 cents more. And then home health aides, which really, if we were really thinking wages were going to be impacted by demand or need for their services, you would think that those would be skyrocketing. They have lost wages since 2000, even including this pandemic increase. So they're still down about 7 cents. And so we're not seeing this sort of like demand equals wages sort of show up exactly right in our in the data. So there's clearly a whole lot of other things going on there. And so thinking about the inflation question. So one of the positive things like I want folks to think about whenever they leave this conversation, because I think this can be a very discouraging conversation, is that, people have in Ohio come together and made different policy choices. So in 2006, the state voted to increase our minimum wage, and then we indexed it to inflation at that time. And so Ohio, our floor at least has a little buffer against inflation. So at the end of the year, we'll look at the index and minimum wage will again be recalculated. The issue with that, however, is that back in 2006, we didn't increase the value enough to fully recapture the value that had been lost since like 1968. So what we're doing essentially in Ohio at the minimum is holding steady with where we were back in 2006. And so that's a tiny bit of a positive, and that's only because Ohioans voted to make it so. The rest, the larger inflation question, very much is a concern about stripping away what little increase those occupations that have actually seen an increase are gaining in this time.
So Kirby asks, we hear vaguely from time to time that employers who raise wages find that they more than make up the cost by improved productivity. Is there data on that? Are there numbers to that? Is that a myth? Is that a real thing? And would raising wages substantially be a viable policy?
Yes. So I'm like over here Googling a paper that we did. This is a little anecdotal, but we looked at the Greater Cleveland Food Bank raised wages, and we did a report back in 2009 that looked at, hey, what happened there? And we did see that it did improve turnover, and that by raising they raised the base wage 21.7%, but that only actually increased operating costs by 0.5%. And so some of that is the improvement in productivity, the improvement in streamlined administration, the ability to recruit workers, to bring people on, to be more productive, reduce turnover. So I will share the link to that in the paper. And there's other larger studies that talk about those things. And this is something we could actually encourage. Ohio receives a lot of money through our workforce investment, through the Workforce Investment Act, from federal dollars into our workforce development system. One thing that we have put forward is like, we should prioritize those dollars to employers, to occupations and sectors that are dealing with turnover, that are using those dollars to reduce the revolving door in those industries. In an older report, we had some data from Wisconsin. We couldn't get it in Ohio, but we had Wisconsin data that showed that some of these occupations, they looked at nursing homes, had something like 150% turnover. So they were cycling through all of their people. So this is a very real concern and a very real tell on job quality, that if we're looking to invest, we should be smart about it and think about turnover. And one way you can improve turnover is, strangely, I know, breaking news, right, is by paying people fairly, paying them enough that they can bring some order and stability to our life. So I'm going to drop that into the.
Sheida, did you want to add to that?
I'll leave it because I see a lot more questions coming through, but I fully agree.
And I want to ask a question that's in connection to that. We're talking a lot about these things that employers should do and we're also talking about some of the myths surrounding poverty and low wage workers. What of these things that we're talking about are culture shifts that need to change, and what of it is policy shifts that need to happen? And are those the same thing? Do we legislate culture change? What are some of your thoughts on that?
I'm holding off to give Sheida a thought, but I have some ideas on this.
Go ahead. Go for it.
We legislate culture change all the time, whether we realize it or not. And that's from, thinking about the Ohio tax code, for example. We have one tax exemption. It's called the LLC loophole. It's almost $1 billion, costs us almost $1 billion every year. And one of the sort of effects of this that we may not have really been thinking too closely about whenever this was enacted, or the legislatures may not have been, was that it incentivizes this fracturing of work, the fissuring of work. It incentivizes people to be so-called independent contractors instead of employees. Because if you're an LLC, you're not going to pay state tax on that. You can fall into this loophole. The legislation that almost went through, but did not, thanks to probably many folks on this call, lots of advocacy at the State House, was the Senate Bill 17 thing that would have vastly restricted access to public benefits in Ohio, requiring photo IDs, like having the asset test back, setting it something like $4,000. So if you had a used car, which is now probably worth $4,000 plus, even if it is the biggest bomber in the world, you wouldn't qualify for assistance, right? Like, even though those are policies that relate to income, that relate to process, it's also a conversation about culture and who deserves things and what we think someone who deserves support should be doing and what they should look like and how they should act and how they should, how destitute they should be before there's any sort of support. And so what's different, though, is that the legislature has demonstrated it is more than willing to legislate based on that sort of cultural assumption, which is often racialized, to create divisions. But there's an unwillingness to legislate on the other end of that equation when it comes to employer behavior. In fact, we often hear, oh, the employers, we would not be able to have our business if we paid someone $15 an hour. And there's not a question of whether that's a business model that should be sustained, or that is a employment practice that we should subsidize through our policies. Never even broached the question. And so should we? If, we got to ask it. I think the questions have to be asked, and I think we have to interrogate the whys and the hows and our assumptions going into a lot of this policy making.
That's great. So what are some of the things that are working? I'm sorry, Sheida, did I interrupt you? Okay.
Wow.
What are some of the things that are working? I know, Sheida, in the report that was put out by your team, there's conversation around some of the things through the pandemic, some of those measures that were taken, that we have the documentation, the numbers that show it works. What are some of those things, and what are some other things that are working to help?
Sure. Yeah. So I think we've learned a lot of things during the pandemic, right? To this point about culture change and policy change and legislative change and deservedness during the pandemic, it was very much like, well, this is out of people's hands. And so we threw all kinds of programs out. And what we learned, I think I will just say this, I think we've been underscoring this throughout the conversation, is that no one achieves financial security entirely on their own. We rely on these foundational supports from our public and our private benefit systems to stabilize, to build assets, to protect ourselves from larger economic shocks. But the reason that we have things like insurance programs is because we can't always prepare for these extremely large shocks. Public safety net programs we've talked about, there's all kinds of access issues and complexities and hurdles. But what we saw in the pandemic was how fragmented, broken, antiquated some of these systems were, right? Like you needed to find somebody that could code in COBOL, which was, I had to ask my dad, who is, a PhD in computer science, to be like, what is this programming language? And he was like, it's a garbage language that nobody uses anymore, right? Like, it's super old. This is useless, but it is like the only thing that a lot of these public benefits systems are built off of. And so, just recognizing that the pandemic quickly showed us where there were holes, how insufficient these systems are, how some of them we were able to get cash out to people. The people that were able to get it were in much better shape. A lot of people had to wait a really long time, may still be waiting. So the lack of responsiveness, timeliness, accountability of these systems to people is definitely something we should be talking about. But that said, we did see cash infusions on this never before tried scale, really, in the US, underscoring that flexible cash really is critical to maintain stability of workers' cash flow. So I was talking about routinely positive cash flow earlier. This is a non-labor way to boost cash flow. So rather than it coming from work, it was coming from the government. Findings around the economic impact payments, the expanded child tax credit, the expanded unemployment insurance showed over and over again that these measures decreased poverty nationwide, reduced food insecurity for millions of households. The funds allowed families to build a savings buffer ahead of when they knew the transfers would stop, as in the case of child tax credit or the unemployment expansion. That helped people maintain their consumption for longer than without them. It allowed some people to be able to save for the first time because they were making more money as a result of those infusions. And then when it ended, it was extremely detrimental. Shocker. According to Columbia University, child poverty rates increased by 41% from December of last year into January, and 3.7 million families fell back into poverty. And again, these are children that we're talking about. So study after study demonstrated how important, expansive that this cash was. Unrestricted in its use, meaning that families were able to address their own idiosyncratic needs. I talk about this a lot, but if you're somebody who has a child, but you have a grandparent around, then you don't need childcare. Maybe the grandparent can handle that, but maybe you need to be able to fix your car so you can make it to and from work. Maybe you need it to cover your car insurance so that you're not driving uninsured, so that you can get to the job that is giving you that paycheck. So the reason that I really want to push on this cash piece is just that it puts choice and power, dignity, deservedness, right, all back into the hands of the family. We see time and again that people are using that to stabilize their situations, their finances, invest in family well-being. People, when we look at like Stockton's guaranteed income program, people were moving from working 2-3 jobs to one job with better pay, with better hours, more reasonable hours that allowed them to both get benefits from their job, a stable, more, less volatile position. And then they were also able to spend more time with family. Like the mental health pieces that have come out of all of these are just so powerful. In my previous life, I did a ton of interviewing, lots of in-depth interviews with folks across the country, just sitting down and talking to them about their financial lives. And the thing that comes out over and over again is just people share the same goals. But when they said that, like what that money would do, what it could do for them, it was always, it would give me space to breathe. And that's always really stuck with me, and of just how powerful it is of just people wanting enough space that I can just like go to bed and know that the paycheck that comes in is going to cover the bills that are coming, that I can do all the things that I want to do and not, be so stressed about it. So the EIP is expanded unemployment, all of these other cash infusion programs, guaranteed income programs are popping up all over the country. But it's allowing people to have some breathing room. They can save, they can, start to move forward on their goals and not have this like weight of the debts that they've had to take over. But I'll just say that we do need systems and infrastructure in place to make sure that people can actually access those programs, make sure that they can cash those programs, that, the check that comes in without having to pay fines and fees, to receive them, to store them, to then use them, to deploy it. We should also not be getting upset when people are actually able to save for the first time, because that was one thing. They're like, oh, people don't need this. See, they're saving. So you get penalized for not saving, but then you get chastised for saving. It's a separate political problem. But again, this goes back to the deservedness and like, did you really need it if you're saving it? But they're saving for the next time that something comes up, because, with, pandemic aside, something's always going to come up regardless. And unfortunately, these programs did not necessarily continue despite all of this positive research and data that is showing how important it's been, but the child tax credit still ended last year. And I can talk about this for a very long time. So
no, programs that work, that's the thing. We know what programs would work. The problem is that a lot of those things that work run counter to our mythology around what's okay, like our deservedness of being poor. So direct cash payments that are flexible. Two things that have been mentioned here that is not how we run our public benefit systems in Ohio or this country, but we know work to do. I mean, the CTC in Ohio, when that was active, we did we checked some of the survey data coming out around household security. The CTC, week before that started hitting bank accounts, compared to the week after people had that money, reported a drop. 36% fewer Ohio families were reporting that they didn't have enough to eat. 26% fewer adults that had kids in the household reported having trouble with basic household expenses. It works, direct and flexible. Those kinds of programs that are really effective require the policymakers, the gatekeepers, the decision makers to trust people, trust families, to make the right kinds of decisions, to be able to do their family budget, to figure out how and provide sufficient resources so that people and families that are struggling are given a modicum of dignity so that they can save and plan. It's treating people with, basic, it's really recognizing that we all got to where we are because we had lots of support, lots of community support, and being willing to set policies that recognize that and support other people sharing in that prosperity. We have plenty. It's just that we don't think about resource allocation in a way that really honors the dignity of all people. So we know what works in terms of benefit systems. We just have this bizarre concept of who should and shouldn't partake. And there's very little way to separate that out from these myths around the so-called welfare queen, around dependency, that really breaking those ideas that have been so divisive, intentionally so, is really a critical step in allowing us to have the political will to actually enact programs that work. The other side of this is on the economy side. Just as there's a very big imbalance of power and focus in the sort of policy making on our public benefits program, similar imbalance has happened across our labor market, in that there's been a big erosion of collective bargaining and union rights and unions in Ohio and across the country. We think of good jobs and we're like, oh, manufacturing, GM, that's the kind of job that you can work, send your kids to college, pay your bills, take a vacation. That's becoming less so. But the reason that those are good jobs are because those are union jobs. And, if we think about manufacturing used to be an industry where we had child labor. Those were not always good jobs. Mining, coal industry, those jobs that are so prized as being like, oh, they put people through college, they're these high paying jobs. They're high paying because they were union jobs, because there was this bargaining power between the people who were producing the profit for the employers and for the shareholders to set those standards and conditions. And so when we look at very low paying industries that are critically important, like home care, like a CNA, like the people who are doing childcare, those are places where they're providing just incredibly important value, not getting paid, and they have no system to be able to negotiate a fair wage or fair conditions for the work. And so, whenever we think about inequality, it is inequality both in sort of the cash that's coming in, but also in the ability to affect the conditions of our world, both in terms of policy and on the job. So there's two places where if we want to make change, we absolutely can.
So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. You brought up unions, which touches upon a previous question that we had about whether or not unions, to talk about Starbucks and Amazon and things like that. I also want to highlight Brian's question that there's probably not enough time to discuss, but if any or all of the plans from the past 2 years were made permanent, how would they be financed? I think that's a valid, I want to just acknowledge that question and know that we did not get to it. I think that's an additional question to the Ohio revised code. So I think there's a whole other program that we can do on that. I want to make sure that we have at least a really quick opportunity to have both of you, as we close this out, really, what is the thing that you want people walking away knowing most? Like, what is the thing you would most like people to know? And what is something actionable for those that are here for to do in our communities?
Sure. I mean, plenty of things. I would say, again, it is a choice and a result of decisions that have been made that we are in the situations that we are in. So, earlier I said it is one type of worker that really stands a reasonable shot at financial security, those higher income full-time employees receiving workplace benefits. It does not have to be that way. And as we're seeing, that is the share of workers that's declining as companies start to turn away from those. So just a reminder that, elections are coming. Pay attention to what folks are saying, what they're doing, knock on doors, make phone calls, write letters, push the folks that are your representatives. I no longer live in DC. And so now I'm living in a state where I feel like I have more representation and more people I can call. So for those in Ohio, for those outside of the DC area, that's that DC area. You can drive to Virginia, you can drive to Maryland. So as we start to think about solutions, I'll just say, at a high level, there are, my main recommendations here are integrate workers' voice and power into program design and delivery from the start, recognize what it is that people need so that we create systems that actually meet where people are, what they need, what goals they actually have. And my main recommendations would be to find ways to boost routinely positive cash flow. So that can be done through higher wages, boosting worker income in different ways. 2 would be increasing workers' non-labor income. So we talked a little bit about cash programs. And 3, to strengthen and modernize our benefit system to support workers and reduce the cost of living. I will drop a bunch of ideas into the chat so that I am not taking up too much time. But all of this goes from increasing minimum wage, offering consistent hours, paying livable wages, to increasing union power, sectoral wages, pushing for the EITC in your local area so that on top of the federal, there is a state or a local supplement, reinstating the expanded child tax credit, improving the unemployment insurance system. I will stop, but I'm going to jump something. And my coworker just wrote something about 101 different ways that we can push on wealth building. So I'm going to throw that in here too. Plenty of ideas. There's something for everyone, I promise.
I think I love that list. I love it because it's so it makes it so possible. There's so much that we could start doing. And I think one of the questions in the chat was like, this is great, but how do we pay for this? That's real. That's absolutely real. But let me just let me give you an idea of the kind of resources that it's not that we're leaving it on the table, but we're shifting to the most well-off, the very wealthiest in Ohio, people who don't necessarily need the extra help. Like, be wealthy, amen, have at it. We all should get there. That's wonderful. We want to share that wealth. But let me just, give you a little taste of what could be possible in Ohio, just if we started looking at taking our tax system back to, like, I don't know, say a Voinovich era, right? Like, this isn't wild tax policy changes, but so here's some context about paying for this stuff. So the richest 1% of Ohioans, all right, which is probably not us on this call. If that's you and you're interested in this stuff, please contact our development officer. But right, 1% of Ohioans, they contribute an average of $51,000 per year less in state tax revenue than they did 17 years ago. 51,000. On average, however, 60% of tax filers with the lowest income, so 60%, that's going to be me, I'm in there, 60%, we're paying more than we did in 2005. even though all we have heard in every budget cycle in this state is we're cutting taxes, we're cutting your taxes, we're cutting middle-class taxes, we're cutting 60%, the bottom 60% we're paying more. The 20% of Ohioans with the lowest incomes now pay an average of $164 more in overall state taxes than they did 17 years ago. So we can, it's not that we can't pay for this. There's so much room. We just have a revenue system that's sending it, again, based on this discussion of who's holding the reins of policy and who's being listened to, sending it to a very small slice of Ohioans. That can change. And one thing about action steps is that if you're in Ohio, you're interested in these topics, you want to see, you want to make Ohio a more equitable, inclusive, sustainable, vibrant place. Like you want that for yourself and for your neighbors. You may be very disheartened now because you see things like the redistricting conversation, where there's been like constitutional challenges and Supreme Court cases and maps and maps and maps, and it is clearly going against the will of the vast majority of Ohioans, and still there's no change, no accountability, no inroads. So it can be very disheartening. But I want to point out and remind folks that even in these times, 2006, Ohioans raised the minimum wage, right? Even in the last budget cycle, Ohioans came together and forced legislatures to pass, finally, since 1997, a constitutional school funding formula that Ohioans demanded that Medicaid cover new moms for 12 months. It's going to have a real impact on infant mortality and maternal health. These things can actually happen. And so folks are out there. We launched an agenda for Ohio yesterday called the All In for Ohio Agenda. If you want to get involved with these things, if you want to learn more, connect with others, share ideas, and figure out how to really make some transformational change together, that's one place. I'll put the link in the chat, and you're always welcome to follow and connect and share with us here in State at Policy Matters.
Great, thank you. The redistricting conversation will definitely have to wait for another time and maybe another organization. For HFLA, we would like everybody to walk away knowing that we're here. Our website is interestfree.org. If you know somebody who is in need of a loan for a home repair, for a financial emergency, to help with the last gap, final gap in education costs, please come to us. Let's have that conversation. We want to thank everybody today who's attending, and especially like to thank our panelists, Sheida Elmi from the Aspen Institute and Hannah Halbert from North Ohio. I said Halbert instead of Halbert, and I apologize, from Policy Matters Ohio. This has been a great conversation. I echo some of the comments. We may need a part two in some form or fashion, and we will do that in the coming months. So everybody, please stay tuned. We will be sending out in the next day or two a robust list of resources, readings, and articles provided by everybody here, and hope you have an opportunity to take a look at those. Please stay tuned to HFLA. Thank you all for your time, staying a couple of minutes extra, and thank you. That's it.
Thank you all.